Welcome to this video on Miranda versus Arizona, the landmark 1966 Supreme Court case presented here as a mock trial. Miranda versus Arizona began in 1963 in Phoenix, Arizona, as a state felony prosecution for kidnapping and rape. Ernesto Miranda, the suspect, was interrogated for 2 hours and signed a written confession without being informed of his right to remain silent or his right to an attorney. This case explores the intense setting of police interrogation, contrasting the era of forced confessions with the ultimate establishment of the Miranda warnings. Before the 1960s, forced confessions were common, with police using physical violence and psychological coercion to circumvent Fifth Amendment rights. Practices like the third degree were accepted, often resulting in false statements due to the lack of legal counsel. In the actual case, Miranda was identified and questioned for 2 hours. Officers secured a written confession, which stated it was voluntary, but Miranda had not been advised of his rights. This confession became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, highlighting the conflict between police power and constitutional protections. Procedurally, Miranda's attorney moved to suppress the confession, arguing it was coerced. The motion was denied, Miranda was found guilty, and the Arizona Supreme Court affirmed. He then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. We now examine the witnesses and arguments presented during the trial level of the Miranda case. The defense theory was that the confession was coerced and obtained without informing Miranda of his rights. They argued he was overwhelmed by psychological pressure and isolation. Without the confession, the evidence against him was weak, and the Fifth Amendment prohibits compelled self-incrimination. The core conflict in this case was between state power and individual rights. The central question was whether police questioning, without safeguards, violated the Fifth Amendment. This was about the fundamental balance of power during custodial interrogation. Ernesto Miranda, a 23-year-old with limited education, was arrested for kidnapping and rape. After 2 hours, he confessed. Crucially, he was never told of his right to remain silent, that anything he said could be used against him, or his right to an attorney. The Miranda defense called several witnesses, including Ernesto Miranda himself, public defender Alvin Moore, psychologist Dr. Lawrence Spiegel, and Miranda's sister Alice. The Fifth Amendment protects against forced self-incrimination, a right critical during vulnerable police interrogations. Since Miranda was never told he could remain silent, the defense argued this fundamental constitutional protection was violated. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to counsel during critical stages of prosecution. The Supreme Court recognized this right's importance during interrogation, requiring that the right to an attorney be communicated before questioning begins. As the defendant, Miranda testified he was never told of his rights and felt overwhelmed and scared, confessing because he thought it would stop the questioning. This testimony aimed to humanize the accused and question the fairness of the interrogation. Dr. Lawrence Spiegel, a defense expert, provided a scientific framework, explaining the, quote, inherently coercive atmosphere of custodial interrogation. His testimony described how the power imbalance and psychological tactics can overcome a suspect's free will, even without physical violence. Dr. Spiegel analyzed the interrogation environment, pointing to factors like isolation, perceived authority, and lack of external advice that induce stress and pressure, leading to confessions like Miranda's. Miranda's sister also testified, providing an alibi that the police ignored. This showed the state's tunnel vision and their singular focus on obtaining a confession to secure the conviction. Alvin Moore, the defense counsel, objected to the admission of Miranda's confession during the original trial. He argued it was illegally obtained, setting the groundwork for the future appeal to the Supreme Court. Now we examine the arguments and witnesses presented by the state of Arizona. The prosecution's theory was that Miranda voluntarily confessed after being confronted with evidence, using standard procedures. They argued the signed confession was clear and that the state was not required to inform suspects of their rights before questioning. Key Arizona District Court witnesses included Detective Cooley, the primary interrogator, who claimed the confession was completely voluntary, and the victim. However, Miranda's counsel and sister also provided counter-testimony. Detective Cooley testified that the entire process was voluntary, asserting he used no threats or physical mistreatment. The state's case relied heavily on Cooley's testimony to prove the confession's admissibility. The signed, written confession was the core evidence linking Miranda to the crime. Officers had Miranda write the confession, and the state's entire case rested upon the validity of this document. Detective Cooley's role was primary interrogator. He described a calm, procedural questioning, where Miranda eventually chose to confess after being confronted with facts, claiming there was no pressure involved. This slide would typically show a timeline of the interrogation, detailing the actions taken and the alleged tone or context according to Detective Cooley. The victim, an 18-year-old woman, initiated the prosecution and identified Miranda in a lineup. Her identification was crucial to the state's case and helped police obtain the subsequent confession. The trial court had to decide if Miranda's confession was voluntary, if police coercion invalidated it, and if the remaining evidence supported conviction. These were the local questions before the constitutional appeal. The Arizona court ruled to admit Miranda's written confession, finding it was voluntarily obtained. Based almost entirely on this document, Miranda was convicted of kidnapping and rape. The Arizona court admitted the written confession, concluding it was voluntary. Miranda was convicted of the charges, demonstrating the critical weight the court gave to the signed confession. The appeal argued that the Sixth Amendment right to legal counsel applied during police questioning. Since Miranda was never informed of this right, the lack of counsel made his signed confession involuntary. The Arizona Supreme Court upheld Miranda's conviction, affirming that the confession was voluntary and admissible. This decision then led to the appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, focusing on the absence of constitutional warnings. The appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court focused on the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Miranda's team argued that the confession obtained without warnings was inherently coerced. The central constitutional question was whether a confession obtained without constitutional warnings violated the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination during custodial interrogation. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4, concluding that confessions obtained without warnings violate the Fifth Amendment. This landmark decision mandated that police issue specific constitutional rights, fundamentally changing interrogation procedures. The majority opinion, written by Chief Justice Warren, reversed the conviction. It held that custodial interrogation is inherently coercive and that unwarned statements violate the Fifth Amendment. Procedural safeguards must be used to protect these rights. The 4 dissenting justices worried the ruling was not constitutional, but rather policymaking. They felt the new rules would unduly hinder law enforcement and prevent them from securing vital confessions. After the reversal, the state of Arizona retried Miranda. Since the signed confession was inadmissible, the state used other evidence. Miranda was convicted again and sentenced to 20 to 30 years. This concludes our video on the Miranda case.